Corporations Act of 1933 and 1934. In 2000, clearly there was another bubble. The bubble popped. There were a couple of bad companies in there, Tyco, Enron, WorldCom. I mean, there's thousands of public companies out there, and yeah, there are a couple of real bad actors, right? And so Congress decided that it was going to get involved. Congress tried to do good, may have ended up doing more bad than good, because in creating the Sarbanes-Oxley, of the 11 major sections of that legislation, there are 2 that have really become a sticking point for small companies. One is Section 302 of Sarbanes-Oxley, which creates, quote, a need for corporate officers to, quote, set up and they have responsibility for establishing and maintaining internal controls. Okay? And then Section 404 requires an internal control report in the annual Exchange Act filing, which is the 10K. Okay? So this is where they get you on having the CEO and the CFO review the numbers, and then in their 10K certifying that the numbers are good. All right? This creates all sorts of unintended consequences. Now, it is true that there was a problem, because what would happen before Sarbanes-Oxley is somebody would sue the company and say your numbers are bad, and the company would say, oh boy, I'm just as shocked and disturbed about this as you are, why don't you guys go sue the accountants, right? Because the company says, look, this is why we paid accountants to do our books, because we're transferring the liability over to the one of the big 4 or 5, I think there were 5, now there are 4 accounting firms, right? Because one of them got caught up in this, right? And the accounting firms are sitting there saying, oh, wait a second, we got bad information from the company. Or they say, oh, I'm shocked and amazed, there's this one CPA who's a bad guy, we'll fire him. And the investors felt like they were getting a runaround. So what Congress decided to do with Sarbanes-Oxley was to make the CEO and the CFO both attest that in fact they had looked at these numbers and they attested that they were correct. So no longer could the CEO and the CFO do the hot potato thing of, wow, real problem here, it's the other guy's fault. Okay? The problem with that, of course, is that a lot of small companies are taking risks, trying to raise capital to keep their companies afloat, and they don't want to take these risks if they're going to end up in jail. The other problem with Sarbanes-Oxley, which is a real problem, is as we've discussed, a lot of these laws are not clearly written, right? Everyone here has heard of insider trading, right? Insider trading is when the insider has some little bit of information, right? And he passes it off to somebody who trades on the information. Anyone here want to tell me what the Congress says defines, how they define insider information? Doesn't exist. Anyone here want to tell me how the SEC defines insider information? Doesn't exist. So this is one of those things that you run into with being a CEO or a CFO, is you deal with a lot of regulations that are not well defined. You have court decisions that you can look back to try to interpret the courts, but the courts are always dealing with specific instances. So you end up looking for a pattern amongst court decisions to try to anticipate which side of the line you're on. It's not a clear line. And so if you're a small company and compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley can cost you $1 to $4 million a year, is what the estimates have been, and you're in an industry where there are $8 billion a year in legal settlements against companies for violating SEC laws, and you're a little company making $5, $10 million a year, why are you going to want to be part of this? You don't want to be part of this. You just opt out. You don't register. Or you register on one of the European exchanges, right? So the primary impact of Sarbanes-Oxley for small companies has been there's less of a desire to be in the public exchanges. Not that there weren't problems, right? Reporting requirements. All right. So here is, let's just actually go through and actually read what the 33 Act says, okay? When you are reporting the SEC, these are the types of things that you need to report. You need to report the operations of the company, okay? You need to go through and actually list the officers, directors, the big shareholders. You need to talk about their salaries, their benefits, their relationships, transactions. You need to talk about the financial condition of the business. Notice how broad the wording is. Remember when I said when Congress passes laws to make it very broad? All right, the financial condition of the business, including financial statements. audited by an independent CPA, all right? They don't tell you which line items you gotta have, all right? Even the SEC gives broad discretion to FASB. And it's FASB that then sets up exactly what the items are. Remember the whole thing about expensing stock options? It was a FASB issue, not an SEC issue, okay? So these are the things that they require you to report when you report to the SEC. Now, first off, that doesn't look so bad, right? This information, you do it once, a lot of this stuff you can just keep filing every time, right? Especially the stuff about who the officers are, etc. Okay? Now, when you file with the SEC, you file a registration statement, you want to go public, it comes in two forms, all right? You've got the prospectus, which is the bit of the filing which is actually going to be distributed to investors, okay? And then you've got the extra info that the SEC keeps and they don't circulate around, okay? Most companies, when they're going public, will file what's called Form S1, okay? And in the business description of the S1, and there's a smaller one, there's what's called the SB1, if you are raising less than $10 million, okay? And what it will discuss is its business, its properties, its competition, the identity of the officers. These are the specifics that you ask for in Form S1, okay? And if you think about this, S1 is kind of the most draconian form. It takes a lot of time to fill out an S1. We'll show you Google's S1 in a moment, okay? SB1 is basically the same types of information but less detail on each one. And a private placement memorandum, which we'll discuss in greater detail tomorrow, it's the same type of stuff, just even less detail. Remember, a lot of these forms, right, when the forms were actually structured and they decided what's going to be in the form, what isn't going to be in the form, it was Joe Kennedy. And Joe Kennedy kind of said, well, gee, what are the questions I ask before I invest in a company? I assume that these investors want to know the same thing that I'd be asking. And you always want to know, what business are they in? Who's running the business? How successful has the business been? Let's look at some of the key transactions. And so we put it into these forms. Now, one of the things that the S1 also controls, and this is something that any investor should always ask, whether it's a public or a private transaction, is what are the risk factors? Okay? Now, a good set of risk factors starts with the assumption that most businesses fail. Over time, I think all businesses fail. The oldest company in the world, I think, was a Japanese shrine maker. It was like 600 years old. It just failed. It took it 600 years. But most of the business statistics say that if you take a look over a 5-year period, most businesses fail before the first 5 years, right? So when you're putting down your risk factors, you're basically asking, okay, what are the 3 most likely reasons that this company's going to fail? We assume it's going to fail. Those are just statistics, right? You take a look at the past, most companies fail. And so going into it, you'd like to know what are those reasons, right? The problem is, and the Securities Act of 1933 spells it out. You talk about lack of business operating history, adverse economic conditions, lack of a market, etc. And these are the same types of things that will get put into a private placement memorandum. We'll talk about more in the next section. But one of the things that's important to note here is that the way these things get implemented on Wall Street is they talk about very broad and general risk factors that aren't necessarily practical. Okay? So what you'll end up with are what are called boilerplate risk factors. And a boilerplate risk factor will be things like the sky could fall. And if the sky falls, your investment won't be worth anything. Now, that's obviously a pretty silly one. But, you know, lack of business operating history. I mean, there's wording floating around the street which basically says this company does not have a long business operating history. Because it does not have a long business operating history, there's no assurance that this business will continue to operate going forward. And now they've satisfied the requirement. In other words, a lot of these risk factors that are called for in S1, they have wording that satisfies it, and they just use it again and again and again. It's copy and paste into each one of these S1s, right? And therefore, you really don't get a lot of useful information out of them. Now, when you go public, you have what's called a quiet period. And in a quiet period, you filed your documents with the SEC, and the SEC is reviewing them to make sure that all material facts are there, okay? And during this quiet period, which generally lasts about 25 days, You learn